Good night, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of State of Our Nation. This time, this is the first time that we are going live, and it's a special occasion. Of course, it's our first attempt at a budget analysis, and this is immediately after the Prime Minister would have delivered her 3-hour budget speech. Now, there are quite a few things to unpack. We see the Prime Minister would have introduced measures for relief on several things, including COVID, including the current cost of living due to exogenous shocks like the war on Ukraine, etc. The cap on fuel, on VAT on fuel, sorry. The cap on freight costs to pre-COVID levels, zero rated goods, which has also been extended to include diabetic and other nutritional food stuff that persons would use along that line. Special water rates for farmers. However, there were some revenue raising measures as well, which would include the one off pandemic contribution levy. And that would be 15% of the profits from the last couple of years that didn't suffer much damage as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And also on income for persons that make more than $6,200, and that would be for 12 months. And that's expected to raise a revenue of around $15 million or so. Um, as I said, it's quite a lot to unpack. I have with me two guests here, Professor Justin Robinson from the University of the West Indies, as well as representing Labour would be the president of CITUSAB, who would give some insight on what he saw in it for Labour. Now, we will start with Professor Robinson. Professor Robinson, I know that we are fresh from the what was said, and we are putting you on the spur of the moment here, trying to break this all down in such a short space of time. But give us your thoughts on your initial thoughts on this budget right off the bat.
Okay, thanks. So the budget is somewhat what I would have expected in terms of the government coming in and trying to balance some competing objectives. I think one key element coming in that I would have focused on was that fact that the estimates show the government having a deficit of 3.3% of GDP. And a deficit of 3.3% of GDP is not consistent with Barbados' economic strategy of trying to get to a debt to GDP of 60% by 2033, meeting the IMF targets, and really restoring our economic stability. So I was not surprised to see revenue raising measures as the government tried to close that gap to maintain its economic credibility. So I think that was expected. I think one of the things, quick numbers I'm trying to crunch is the extent to which how much of that gap, because I think there was about a $386 million gap that needed to be made up outside of debt service that needed to be made up. I'm trying to get a sense as to how much of that was made up, because what is not made up has to be borrowed, and we are already significantly off target with our debt to GDP targets. So one of the things that stood out for me is the fact that also the target has now been extended to 2035. And one of the things the government has to be careful about is that it does not lose the hard-won credibility built up after 2018 when it went into the IMF program, implemented budget, and had gains in 2019. That the government does not appear that in the case of a crisis or difficulty, that they're quite willing to step back from that. So I expected to see attempts to close the gap. I don't quite have the precise calculation as to how much was closed, but I did notice that the debt to GDP target was pushed back by a further 2 years. And I think the government has to be careful that it doesn't lose the credibility that it's fought so hard to win. I think they were also expected, given the surge in oil and freight prices and so on, that there would be some degree of relief that are targeted. So the capping of the VAT take and the freight costs, I think, are somewhat expected. The capping of the freight, I think one of the other themes that comes out for me in the budget, like, and I think the government has to be careful with, in that the burden of the fiscal adjustment seems to have been placed on the private sector. We haven't really seen cuts in a major way in government expenditure. But the burden, so, because in sense, when freight cost, well, it says that capping there, the private sector picks that up. We see a special tax on companies that seem to have done well during the pandemic or not lost as much. And is the private sector now being asked to bear the brunt of that? And what is the government's share on its terms of its own expenditure? Because in many ways, many other aspects of the budget, the government has gone ahead and tried to implement some of its campaign promises and so on, and offering some eases. So I think the Prime Minister of Finance tried to juggle these competing objectives of closing the fiscal gap, providing targeted relief, honoring some of our election or other promises, and providing a path for growth. Because the other aspects in terms of growth, some of them are medium to long term, and those were laid out. So that's my initial take.
Okay. Well, Mr. O'Neill, you obviously your focus will be on labor, but I mean, do you think that there was enough in it in terms of for labor and as well as relief for workers as well who have been on the front line of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic as well? Was there enough in it in this budget for in terms of relief?
Well, let me attempt to answer your question in this way. Everyone knew that government coming into this exercise would be trying to recover some of the money expended over the 2 years, the approximately 2 years of closure. But I thought that in some respects, while the Minister of Finance tried to cater to the different sectors, that she was somewhat timid. Now, of course, all Barbados will welcome the capping and ultimate reduction in the lowering of the cost of hydrocarbons. So to that extent, everybody will breathe a sigh of, not because that's a saving not only directly at the gas pump, but that's going to be a saving on the cost of doing business. When I say that I thought the Minister of Finance was somewhat timid, operating at the back of my mind is the European civil war between Ukraine and Russia. And the information I have is that the two combatants are responsible for a significant amount of grain, the production of grain. So that is going to be withdrawn from the international market, either through sanctions against Russia or the destruction of Ukrainian industry. I thought that this was a good opportunity for the Minister of Finance to use taxation as a tool of development right here in Barbados. What do I mean by that? There are a number of pieces of land laying idle. So if I am correct in my expectation that there's going to be a shortage of grain, then I thought that this was an important opportunity for the government of Barbados to start going after those lands that are laying idle through taxation. And of course, the reward would be, if you bring it into production, then a significant reduction in taxes. And I thought that there should have been some encouragement. We in Sidu Sab have long been championing the cause of import substitution. I think the bakeries have shown that they can use cassava and breadfruit in the production of bread. I don't expect to see them breadfruit trees overnight, but certainly lands could have been, an incentive could have been put there for lands to start getting prepared for cultivation, knowing that when our rainy season comes, if you give the cassava about 4 to 5 months for the tubers to reach maturity, then we would have had the production of a crop that would go somewhere to easing the raw material shortages that are bound to come. I thought also that if the NCDs are identified as a problem, and it is foreseen that they will take a larger slice of the national budget to treat them, I thought that some way could have been found to start approaching employers where they are working into their workplace exercise routines and periods of exercise of their labor force, hopefully to reduce that level of incidence of these NCDs. And another area that I found timid or contradictory, if the plan is to go with green energy full tilt, because we want to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, I thought the message was somewhat contradictory in now offering those persons who buy generators to get them duty-free over a 2-year period. Could that money not have been aimed at bringing more persons into the photovoltaic realm? Because it is my understanding that if you're going to be generating your own electricity, then you don't need a standby generator, because you literally, depending on your battery capacity, you will have your power supply constantly, and therefore will not be subject to the power breaks, which would necessitate the use of the generator. Those are my preliminary and cursory observations as to what I heard this evening. Naturally, I can't digest all of it. I will certainly need to be advised further, but those are the things that leapt out at me. Thank you.
Okay, that's excellent opening salvo from everyone. However, I want to pick back up on Dr. Robinson's point about the private sector seemingly bearing the brunt of this adjustment or this recovery, and no. 15% of the profits, again, a one-off payment. And also, you're seeing the raise in commercial rates on natural gas. And also, you're seeing the 20% tariff on sweetened beverages. Yes, one can argue, yes, that goes towards the whole disincentive of adding sugar to these drinks. However, from the little I know of economics, I'm no economic guru by any stretch of the imagination, but the private sector tend to when they incur these additional measures or costs in taxes attached to them, they tend to pass it on to the consumer. Now, would it defeat by adding these measures on them? Is it defeating the whole purpose of trying to lower the cost of living? I mean, do you think that inevitably is going to result in some of these costs being passed on to the consumer, Dr. Robinson?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I would say it defeats the purpose, but you have a fiscal. There's a need for the government has a financial gap that it wants to close, and when you're seeing an attempt to close a gap, you are looking at the distribution of the effort. Who is bearing the effort? And the budget does show that there is that high effort from companies that were seen to have perceived to have done well. And some of these measures can be passed on. They do affect corporations and they adjust their behavior. One of the interesting things about the tax measures, particularly the corporation tax, and it would be interesting to hear from some tax experts, is that it is a retroactive tax in that it's due on the taxable income for 2020 and 2021. The banking, insurance sectors are especially affected. And, the banks already they already pay an asset tax. They would have borne the brunt of the debt restructuring in 2018. So they're certainly not going to be pleased about this and seeing that they are being singled out in terms of bearing the burden. Because they could argue that, they were innocent bystanders and victims of the pandemic like everyone else, and that they adjusted their business models to help get the society through the pandemic, and now they are being asked to make a substantial contribution. And the question might be raised, well, where's the contribution on the government expenditure side in terms of really seeking to close that troubling financing gap that was outlined in the estimates coming on some weakness from before. So there's always the risk of how will the private sector react to these states or sort of these measures that they're facing.
Okay.
It was mentioned, and I would like to commend the government on the further attempts to push the renewable energy revolution. This certainly is something that was started, and it's always great to see that continuity in government policy. Because this was started very much under the DLP administration, where they spoke a lot about renewable energy. I mean, I was looking at a study, in 2010, there were 4 solar electricity systems in Barbados generating like 7 kilowatts. By 2017, this had grown to 850 solar systems generating 22,885, and we are making a quantum leap from that base. So I certainly am pleased to say, because there are a number of measures there seeking to encourage investment in electric vehicles and so on, and other alternative, and also vehicles powered by other sources of energy. So I think that's quite commendable as we continue to drive this renewable energy revolution in the Barbados context. And the government seems to have a plan to use renewable energy and those revenues from the licenses to finance a number of state-owned corporations. The Prime Minister spoke at length at that. I mean, I find that an interesting model. It could be useful. Although again, I do have a concern that on the state side, on the public sector side, the approach seems to be to find financing solutions, to find ways to generate revenue, to keep these operations going, to upgrade what they offer and keep it in the public sector, as distinct from, so that's in the philosophical, as distinct from a drive to reduce their expenditures, make them more efficient, or even turn them over to private operations. And there does seem to, the policy focus seem to be to find financing solutions for these state-owned enterprises, and renewable energy seems to be one of the ways to fund them. It's an interesting way. I mean, I wouldn't knock it, but sometimes I wonder, is that the best use of the windfall of the revenues from renewable energy to be pumping it into the state-owned enterprises? And I think that's a debate the country might want to have. Is that the most effective, efficient use of those expected revenues as we transition the energy base? I mean, to give a concrete example of,
Go right ahead, Dr. Robinson.
as I say, this is not so much a criticism as maybe a different way of thinking. So I thought that, for example, when you started charging homeowners like $1.50 a day on their water bill towards garbage collection paid through the water authority, I sort of wondered, if people are going to pay that money, it's not coming through the consolidated fund anymore. Are we missing an opportunity to privatize this operation, create a new set of small and medium-sized businesses, empower employees at the SSA to now become owners in small, medium-sized companies, and take that out of the state sector so that the state can focus its energies on some of these new and emerging challenges? But maybe that's more of a philosophical, ideological difference, as distinct from a criticism of what seems to be an attempt to use the renewable energy revolution as a financing strategy for the state-owned enterprise.
Okay.
I'm hoping that maybe this can somewhere down the road redound to a reduction in tax and the cost to Barbadians, if because we are still a relatively heavily taxed society.
Okay. Mr. O'Neill, from a labor perspective, I mean, we do see some areas where labor has been on the front line of some of this as well, including the pandemic contribution. They also have a part to play where that is concerned as well. However, we also see where there is now going to be the reopening of discussions on the allowance, which has been stagnant since 2009. Give us your thoughts on the labor aspect of the budget. Do you think that, are you happy with what you have seen presented for labor thus far?
Well, Colville is not so much a case of being happy or unhappy. I don't know that in the public affairs, when budgets are coming, the thing is that there's a build-up from informed commentators as to the pain that will be visited on us through the budget, so that when the pain is not as great as anticipated, then there's that feel-good factor, that sense of relief. Now, I would have, as I said in the opening, everyone who has any passing knowledge about government finances knew that there was going to be an attempt to recoup some of that money that was paid out over the 2 years. It is interesting that the Minister of Finance speaks about the allowances. Of course, what she did not say is that there is already submissions to the Ministry of Finance from CDUSAB about salaries negotiations for this cycle. So I'm not going to bring any tales out of school because these matters always have a level of confidentiality attached to them until such time as they've progressed to a point that we can make our positions public. Certainly, having submitted them, we are not yet at that stage. As regards this budget, the impact on labor, one of the things that leapt out at me immediately was the talk about pension reform. Now, the Minister of Finance has a certain amount of license and freedom in a budgetary presentation, but this will certainly have impact on the conditions of service. So I don't see that going forward without some serious and intense discussions and negotiations, because you cannot arbitrarily change a man's conditions of service like that. And there are persons who came into the service being governed by one level of expectation, and there certainly has to be a leeway before any serious changes to the established arrangements can be embarked on. So that's one area that I think will immediately attract the attention of labor. What do these proposals for pension reform mean? And I have to view them only as proposals rather than a done deal at this stage.
Well, my next question will be for both of you, and I would like both of you to jump in at any interval. Um, do you think the pain, because there is some pain, there is revenue raising measures, and there is relief on one hand, is it balanced? Does the pain balance out against the relief that has been provided? Anyone can step up and take this one first, because I would like to get both of your responses.
Well, go ahead, Professor. Go ahead.
No. I'll come after you. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I certainly couldn't speak to that in a definitive way, because the outcome to determine whether it is painful or not, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. Is the worker going to be better off than they were up to yesterday with these measures? And better off in terms of the amount of money that is extracted from their salary and emoluments. I haven't had a chance to do that kind of calculation, and I'm sure that you would appreciate that a layman like me. It would take me longer to arrive at that position than the esteemed professor. Thank you.
Professor Robinson?
Yeah, so I mean, I think your perspective on whether it's balanced or not would probably depend on your income level. So clearly, persons in that persons earning 6,000 or more, they're certainly having a higher income tax that they're going to have to pay out. So that's certainly a loss in salary. How much of that is made up by savings at the pump or freight? I have a sense that those persons could very well be slightly worse off. And then the cost to the corporate sector of a retroactive taxation. So persons who work in that corporate sector, where those firms are impacted, I think especially the financial sector, which would have borne the brunt of the debt restructuring in 2018. They already pay an asset tax. So this is a retroactive tax on 2 years of their profits. So the impact on that sector and how it filters down to executives and employees within that sector, I think that sector is, again, they are likely to feel worse off, but persons who are not in those categories are probably coming out ahead with this budget. So in a sense, you're really taking from one group to subsidize the other group and to close the gap.
Okay. Professor Robinson, another question at you, and also I would like Mr. O'Neill to give his input afterwards as well. Um, how much of this budget do you believe was constrained by commitments already made to the International Monetary Fund?
Well, I think the revenue raising measures and the nature of some of the eases and the fact that we saw a number of things pushed back. So when you look at the budget, you would have noticed that the eases in land tax, which were a big part of the Labour Party election campaign, those have been pushed back quite significantly. I'm trying to find the exact.
I think the 2023, April 2023, the land tax waiver will take
Land
effect.
tax threshold till 2023 and until 2026 for the 400,000. So the impact I see. So the fact that we are an IMF program, and the fact also that we have put out there that our economic policy is anchored by getting to a debt to GDP ratio of 6% by a certain date, that places a constraint on the size of the deficit you can run, the amount, which means the amount of borrowing you can do, and so on. So I think that was an elephant in the room, which would have led to the revenue raising measures. I don't think the administration or any administration particularly likes to come with new taxes, particularly after the tax measures of 2019. Because when I think of this in terms of that budget in 2019, where that $6,000 income or group above that, they would have gotten some tax relief. Now they have this levy, but also we had things like the tax on online shopping, measures like that, VAT on that, which would have, again, that's the group that does a lot of that. So I think these revenue raising measures, the delay in the implementation of a number of policies like the land tax ease, and the fact that some of the eases are quite moderate is shaped by that need to to really have a deficit that is consistent with the IMF program and also with our stated economic strategy.
Okay. Mr. O'Neill, you're up to bat.
Well, after a presentation like that, there really isn't anything you can add to that. We've had the Work Monitoring Committee, and each time the judgment of the IMF has been that we are meeting our targets. So they're satisfied with the progress of the Barbadian economy. You will recall, though, that there was when government embarked on this program, there was no COVID. There was no ash fall, as the Prime Minister put it. There were no storms. And almost as soon as you got that in place, then came the triple whammy. And then there was a relaxation of the initial conditionalities that the IMF had put. And yet, in spite of that, they could come periodically and say that Barbados is meeting its targets. So that really is the area, I suppose, that at the philosophical level, the argument would be that the heaviest imposition of taxes are on the ones who can best bear it. And the Minister of Finance was very specific to talk about these persons earning under 4,000, as opposed to those who are up in the 6 and the 8,000s, which they were targeting. So that's not just an economic position, but actually a mathematical one as well, that the 6 is greater than the 4.
Okay. If we may just shift back to the cap on VAT on fuel. Now, this is not by any means a static equation. Obviously, from my understanding, the increase we had last Sunday reflected the increase on the world market about 3 weeks ago. And we are still yet to see the increase on the 130 up to $130 per barrel, which would be as the real consequence of the war on Ukraine. Now, how much of a difference, Dr. Robinson, do you believe this VAT on fuel is going to make? I mean, as given the volatility of the situation and as fuel continues to rise and is quite unstable, do you think it's going to make a difference, a major difference at the pump, let's say in another 3 weeks' time when that adjustment is made again?
Yes, I expect it would be a difference that would be noticeable to commuters because you are capping the VAT. I mean, a decent chunk of the cost of fuel at the pump is because of the taxation, and the VAT is the one that really moves with the value. So we would still be impacted by increases in oil prices or fuel prices if that occurs. But the size of the increase would be cushioned by the fact that the government is capping the tax state. And in a sense, some of that is only a limited revenue loss for the government because, since it's not money they have, it's
Right.
not money they have being collected. So it's a kind of opportunity loss as to what they would have collected if they had kept the imposition in place. So I do expect it will cushion. If you're thinking in terms of the absolute price that people pay at the pump, then how much of a change it make will depend on what is happening with the underlying fuel prices.
Okay.
And I think important to what you're saying, I think particularly with that matter of freight and fuel, I think we can expect the government to be monitoring that and to come back to the public if need be, because those are quite fluid situations. Because, oil prices, I mean, we don't expect it, but it could suddenly drop.
Right. Now, I would like to get a response. We're heading to the winding down stage, but I would like to get a response from both of you. Would you have liked to see more measures put in place? Sorry, that would ensure, because it seems that we are going by good faith here as it relates to passing on of any savings to the consumer. Um, would you have liked to see more things in the budget that would guarantee that whatever, like for example, the zero rating of those goods is indeed passed on to the consumer? Start with Mr. O'Neill and then to Dr. Robinson.
Well, Colville, like I said, there's a certain reality which governs the level of your expectations. We are not insulated or indeed isolated from the rest of the world. So there was always going to be a level of moderation in the realistic expectations of what government was going to do here. That certainly is my view. Could government have gone further? I think there are, like I said, I thought that the Minister of Finance was trying to please as many people as possible. No, certainly one area I thought they could have gone further would have been in the nexus between the sugarcane and the rum producers. Does anybody have what the rum producers are paying for the importation of molasses to make their very fine product? I know some years ago when I was I done some research, and the rum producers were making in excess of 200% profit on the cost that they had paid for the raw material. So I say all that to ask, what would be the percentage of, well, not just the percentage. What if instead of importing molasses, the rum producers were funneling that money into the further development and expansion of the acreage under cultivation, which would have produced more of a local flavor to the rum? I know there's at least one rum interest that has a similar plan, but these profits and the cost of the importation of the raw material, I thought was something that could have been exploited and further developed. So that's my take on it. And of course, I'm looking, even when I'm finished talking with you, I'll have to go over to see just how far these measures are impacting on labor, apart
Okay.
from what we see up front. Thank you.
Professor Robinson, your take on measures that could have been included to guarantee that the relief is indeed passed on to the consumer. Your take on that?
Yes, well, I certainly would. No. So in economics, we have a saying that prices are sticky downwards. So prices at a certain level and they tend not to go down. So that's something we say in economics. I'm not sure what the government can do outside what the Prime Minister said in terms of monitoring the extent to which these are passed on. But I don't have that perspective on our private sector. I certainly expect them to operate within the law, and if these are not vatable, that they would not apply the VAT. I mean, there are always exceptions, but I don't have a sense that we have a private sector that willy-nilly acts outside the law, particularly something like the implementation or the attachment of a value-added tax. So I fully expect that the businesses are going to, for the most part, or the vast majority of players are going to comply with this.
Okay.
I have a
No,
concern
go right ahead, Dr. Robinson.
I do have a concern in principle about a retroactive corporation tax. I mean, that's certainly interesting in principle. You're really singling out a particular group for a retroactive tax, which does seem to violate some principles around tax fairness and tax equity.
Okay. All right. We are now approaching the wrap up stage of our discussion, and believe me, it was quite insightful as it was enlightening. Now, I would like to give each of you a minute where you can just give me your final thoughts on what transpired. It's been a long day, a long 3 hours, a big mouthful from the Prime Minister. But just if you can, in a quick minute, um, just give me a quick synopsis of your thoughts on what transpired. Uh, Mr. O'Neill, starting with you.
All right. Well, like I said, and I guess I'll continue saying this over the next couple of days. The efforts to lower the cost of living at the level at the pump is bound to be beneficial to the economy and to labor. The attempt or the offer to make water cheaper to a greater number of farmers should help to put some relief on the cost of food, at least locally produced. And we are always going to be concerned about the health of the workforce. And I think that any measure that is aimed at improving the health of workers and families will always be welcome. Now, I am not too enthusiastic about the increase on the cost of sweetened beverages. We have seen that before. The same argument was made about being a disincentive, and all that happened is there was a temporary lull, and there was an escalation in the cost of drinks, and then Barbadians were back to their old habits with the increased costs. So I fully expect that part of our experience will be repeated, and I regret that a more meaningful attachment to the workplace and employers, that there wasn't a more meaningful effort at drawing up employers into facilitating healthier pursuits among the within the workforce. So thank you very much.
Professor Robinson?
So, in the lead up to the budget, I would have said that I don't envy the Minister of Finance in her role, because she was presenting a budget in arguably the worst set of circumstances faced by any Minister of Finance. And I would want to commend her and her team on the package they came up with as they were seeking to balance some competing objectives, operating within the fiscal targets needed to meet the IMF program and our economic strategy, providing relief to members of society who are most vulnerable to the increases in prices that have been triggered by global factors, addressing some structural issues within Barbados, and also providing an opportunity for growth, or the platform for growth. And to her credit, the Minister of Finance attempted to deal with all of those aspects. And I think the plans are quite credible and workable. So I certainly would commend the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance and her team on what they actually came up with. I do have concerns that as we seek to achieve our fiscal targets, that there seems to be a philosophical approach of finding financing solutions to keep the government going, to keep the state-owned enterprises going, as distinct from deep and fundamental reform, and maybe even having privatization and moving some of these things out of the public realm. And that leads that can be seen that the private sector, which you are asking to lead the growth, is being asked to pick up an unfair share of that adjustment. I certainly, from a tax equity viewpoint, I do have a discomfort with a retroactive levy on profits that is equivalent to 3 times the normal corporation tax rate, and it's aimed at the financial sector, which did bear a massive share of the fiscal adjustment with the debt restructuring, and they already pay an asset tax. So I am concerned because the financial sector is key to the plumbing in the economy. So I do have some reservations around that aspect where we are not seeing cuts in government expenditure, but really more of a focus of trying to raise revenues. And I think we need to have a debate, or we should have a debate around whether the revenues from renewable energy whether using them to fund the operation of state enterprises is really the most effective and efficient use of that factory money.
Okay. Now, there you have it, folks, from the experts themselves. I want to thank both Mr. Edwin O'Neill, president of the seat of CITUSAB, and also Professor Justin Robinson, taking time from his busy schedule to join us tonight, and especially on short notice, right after the Prime Minister would have delivered that budget to provide that analysis for us. Also, want to thank everyone who joined us and listened intently to what the experts has had to say. This is it from me, Colville Mounsey from Nation News. I want to thank everyone again for joining us, and do have a pleasant night.